Good morning, everyone. My name is Dawn Rundman, and I am here today to help you frame your work using science. I am thankful to the Extravaganza planning team for inviting me to lead workshops and intensive care courses here at the Extravaganza for the last decade. My sessions have focused on children's faith formation, typically in the first few years of life. Now, this invitation to lead sessions about children at the Extravaganza shows that the network has expanded its frame of renewal, education, and connection to acknowledge that many of you are working not just with youth, but also with children and all kinds of family structures. Now, when I started my PhD program at the University of Oregon over 20 years ago, the study of infant faith, or the study of infant neuroscience was in its infancy. And it was not uncommon to see something like this walking into one of the research labs. These don't hurt the babies, I promise. These are geodesic sensor nets. And they record brain activity in infants and young children so that the scientists can record and interpret their brain activity. And from these findings have launched entire industries around infant brain development. But the planning team did not ask me to come here and talk to you today about babies. They asked me instead to focus on a different demographic. Which demographic, you ask? Well, a demographic that happens to be included in one of my favorite reports from the ELCA's Office of Research and Evaluation. I don't know if you have a favorite report or not, but this one is Congregation Report Forms, 2004 to 2011. And the row that is enclosed in red shows the number of baptized youth who are confirmed each year between 2004 and 2011. And the year for which we have most recent data, 2011, shows that 38,274 youth were confirmed. Now, let's look at that number more specifically. If 38,274 youth are confirmed each year in the ELCA, that means that at any given time we have between 80 and 120,000 youth between the ages of 11 and 14 in the ELCA. And that is the demographic they asked me to talk about. So, instead of talking about the amazing brain development of a little kid like this, I'm going to talk about the amazing brain development of a youth like this. Now, in working with youth at this young adolescent stage, you have no doubt heard the phrase, "it's just hormones," used to describe all of the changes that are happening between those ages of 11 and 18. The study of early adolescent brains is just now starting to get the kind of attention that infant brain development was receiving 20 or 25 years ago. Neuroscientists focusing on early adolescent brain development are coming up with all kinds of findings for practitioners like you to help frame your work and better understand all the changes they are undergoing, far beyond the explanation of it's just hormones. So, as we think about the development of these young adolescents, let us consider all of the changes that are happening in their brain. If you take a look at this slide, you'll see an area of the brain highlighted that is called the prefrontal cortex. So, just like we checked for wedding rings and earrings yesterday, everybody put your hand on your prefrontal cortex, but I assure you it is not missing. It is there. And this prefrontal cortex is responsible for a host of abilities that are really starting to develop in early adolescence. When they use those mapping techniques like those sensor nets on early adolescents, they find that lots of development is happening here in this area. And one of the things that is coming online at this time and starting to develop is a set of capabilities called executive functioning. Executive functioning includes a number of tasks, and I'll name just a few. Attentional focusing, emotional regulation, impulse control, and long-term planning. So all of these capabilities are starting to become active in the brains of those early adolescents. But there are other structures maturing at this time as well. And so what we'll see in this next slide is a structure called the limbic system. The limbic system is actually a set of structures nestled deep in your brain, and it is known as the emotion center of the brain and also the reward center of the brain. And what researchers who study the limbic systems in early adolescents have found is that in early adolescence, the limbic system is hypersensitive to feelings of reward after risk-taking. So we look at these two systems in the brain that are both developing in early adolescence, the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, but here's the thing. They are not developing at the same rate. They will both reach maturity when we hit our early 20s, but the limbic system is developing more quickly than the prefrontal cortex. And so there's sort of not a disconnect, but the limbic system is sort of out front, in front of the prefrontal cortex in development. And so there's a very well-known researcher of early adolescence named Lawrence Steinberg. And he describes this difference in maturation rates as being like the teenage brain as a car with a really good accelerator and really weak brakes. Now, there are parts of the prefrontal cortex that are developing as well that make up what these researchers call the social brain. And so when they look at tasks like theory of mind in early adolescence, they find prefrontal cortex development. And theory of mind has to do with the understanding that you have different mental states than I do. You have different intentions than I do, you have different emotions, you might respond differently, and that theory of mind is very important for our social interactions because we need to know what other people might be thinking or feeling, not just based on how we are thinking and feeling. They also study the social brain when they look at measuring brain activity in the prefrontal cortex during the experience of social emotions like guilt and embarrassment. Additionally, researchers have looked at early adolescents' brains, and you can probably just imagine this experiment where they're looking at prefrontal cortex activity during irony and sarcasm use. And additionally, there is a task, and you can actually all try it online. I got a score of 33, but you can try it online, and it's called reading the mind in the eyes, which is another task that they can give young adolescents and see that the prefrontal cortex is active. What you see in this slide is the results of research by Dr. Jay Guide. He is another leading researcher of early adolescence, especially brain development. And Dr. Guide's lab and a number of other labs have also found that the maturation of the prefrontal cortex, and specifically the volume of gray matter that we have in our prefrontal cortex, peaks in early adolescence. Peaks. That is, we have the most gray matter in our prefrontal cortex than we will ever have in our entire lives between the ages of 11 and 14. Now, you may be thinking, wait, didn't you just say the prefrontal cortex was responsible for emotional regulation, impulse control, attentional focusing? So there's a reason for that. There's a reason why we have the most gray matter, and then as the brain gets more blue with age, that volume of gray matter decreases. And so to sort of figure out why, I'm going to have us turn first of all to some really sort of poetic botanical terminology and imagery. So if you take a look at this next slide, you can see that this is a stain of nerve cells in the brain. And the brain has these structures called dendrites in each of our nerve cells. And the dendrites receive messages from other cells. And because experiences can help the dendrites extend to more cells, they start to branch out like a tree. And so the process is described as dendritic arborization. So again, that nice poetic botanical term like tree branches spreading up into the sky. But dendritic arborization is not the only process going on here. There is another process called synaptic pruning. And synaptic pruning happens when connections in the brain are pruned away because those pathways are not reinforced. So we have this arborization, which is this branching out, but we also have this pruning away, which is very important. And that's why we see peak gray matter volume in early adolescence, because the pruning hasn't happened. And when you prune, your brain gets more efficient. Now, these naturalistic terms and images are lovely, but I thought we could turn to a different image, especially given our context here, to try to figure out what is going on in that brain. And so if you think about the early adolescent brain being full of ballroom chairs that all need to be reorganized, that is sort of another way to think about the magnitude of the task at hand here. It is not going to be easy, and it's going to take a while to say, where should the rows go? Where should the aisles go? How do we make traffic most efficient in a big old space? But you are there to help them with this big reorganization. So let us turn to a very critical Lutheran question here. What does this mean? You know, you're getting your science lesson at 10:15 in the morning, maybe not what you expected. But what does this mean for those of you working with young adolescents whose brains are on the verge of something very, very exciting? Well, this means that you accompany them while they're rearranging all the ballroom chairs, while all this rewiring is going on. But this is really important to realize. You can make a difference in how their brains are wiring and connecting and reconnecting. Isn't that amazing? You can have a difference on the actual physiology, the neurology of the kids in your care, because you are providing new experiences for them, for those dendrites to arborize and spread out. You are providing experiences that let them have more efficient pathways, that have synaptic pruning happen. And you are creating experiences that can stimulate both that developing prefrontal cortex and that faster developing limbic system. And so what we have here is a both-and situation. When you look at the tension between the two, between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, you provide them with experiences that can start tapping into those executive functioning abilities by giving them opportunities for learning and for leadership. You are there with them when that social brain is at work, giving them positive social experiences, and you provide them with really exciting activities that can stimulate that limbic system. And you know that some kids crave that stimulation and that reward and risk-taking more than others. You have the power to shape their brains during this very exciting but vulnerable time in their development. And I ask that the Lord be with you as you shape those brains. Thank you.